What is up, everyone? Today's true story is one of the most incredible tales of secret duty and family injustice you will ever hear. My parents spent nearly a decade telling everyone I was an army dropout because I couldn't handle the heat. I attended my little brother's prestigious graduation ceremony and kept my mouth shut, until his commanding officer looked straight at me and asked, "Major, are you here?" That single word shattered 8 years of lies. Settle in for the ultimate military reveal. My relatives publicly claimed I was a National Guard washout. I remained silent during my younger brother's elite unit commissioning ceremony. Then, his brigadier general stared directly at me and stated, "Major Lawson, is that you?" The entire assembly froze instantly. My father's mouth fell open, hitting his chest. The atmosphere became intensely charged as General Davies's words reverberated throughout the packed venue. I could feel hundreds of eyes scrutinising me, especially those of my mother and father seated in the front section. Their faces drained of colour, as if they had just encountered a terrifying spectre. Not merely a ghost, but the spectre of the deceit they themselves had manufactured. I am Ethan Lawson, 35 years old, and for the last 8 years my family has systematically informed everyone that I abandoned the armed forces out of sheer lack of nerve. My father, Harold, a former captain who never attained the high military achievements he craved, had turned my supposed failure into his preferred topic of conversation during all family gatherings. Ethan couldn't endure even the initial 3 months of basic training, he would frequently repeat while pouring fine scotch for his guests. Fortunately, we have Ryan. He possesses the necessary resolve. My mother, Judith, would nod in agreement, displaying a look of both disappointment and profound shame, acting as if I had permanently soiled the family's honour. The actual truth was completely different. I had been privately recruited for a clairvoyant operations intelligence unit, so sensitive and classified that I was prohibited from disclosing its very existence to my immediate family. I signed rigorous confidentiality agreements that forbade me from discussing my true rank, my specific missions, or my location. While my parents believed I held a mundane position at a small security agency in Dallas, I had secretly orchestrated and led sensitive missions across more than 20 nations, rapidly advancing to the rank of major. Every Thanksgiving, every birthday celebration, every family reunion became an exhausting exercise in self-control. "At least you managed to find a role you can handle," my father would remark, patting my shoulder condescendingly while lavishly praising Ryan's rudimentary achievements in his own training. "Your brother will soon join a specialised ranger battalion. Do you comprehend the significance of that?" Of course I comprehended. I personally designed the training curriculum for several such units. Achieving justice seemed entirely impossible as long as I upheld my vow of silence, but fate often manifests itself in unpredictable ways. When Ryan invited me to his commissioning ceremony, I agreed to attend, despite fully understanding how emotionally difficult it would be. My younger brother was not to blame for our parents' deception. He genuinely believed I was a washout, because that is the narrative they had fed him since he was 16. "I know this might be uncomfortable for you," he messaged me, "but your presence would mean a lot to me." I chose a seat in the final row, intentionally far from my parents, wearing simple civilian attire instead of the highly decorated uniform that was my rightful standard dress. What nobody in my family knew was that General Davies, who was presiding over the event, had been my immediate supervisor for 3 years during highly sensitive, classified operations. I watched as he approached the podium with his typical, austere posture, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak about integrity, commitment, and self-sacrifice, the very virtues that had forced me to silently endure years of family humiliation. I watched Ryan receive his new insignia with genuine pride, while my parents applauded vigorously, tears welling up in their eyes from the front row. I also applauded discreetly, sincerely happy for my brother's achievement. That is when the unbelievable happened. General Davies paused, meticulously scanned the faces throughout the auditorium, and his eyes abruptly stopped on mine. I saw immediate, unmistakable recognition register on his face, quickly followed by an expression of deep indignation. "Before I conclude today's proceedings," he stated into the microphone, his voice reverberating with undeniable authority, "I must publicly acknowledge an individual whose presence here today is as surprising as it is honourable." A quiet buzz swept through the vast hall. "Major Lawson, would you please rise?" For one elongated second, absolutely no one moved. The only audible sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the timid squeak of seats shifting. I felt the entire world slow down, as if I were submerged underwater. My eyes slowly lifted and met Davies's unblinking gaze. The very man who had assigned me impossible objectives in remote deserts, urban slums and dense jungle environments was now demanding my presence before hundreds of officers and civilian guests. I swallowed hard. I stood up. The grating sound of my wooden chair against the floor seemed for a moment the loudest noise in the entire venue. All faces pivoted toward me. I saw Ryan, eyes wide and mouth agape, as if he had been physically struck by an unseen force. My parents, God help them. Harold was frozen stiff, eyes glazed over, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of shame and rage. Judith brought her hand to her mouth, stifling what sounded like a suppressed scream. I walked down the central aisle like a condemned man being marched to judgment. Each footfall echoed like a grim reminder of every derogatory word they had spoken about me over the past 8 years. The failure, the coward, the family disgrace. Yet standing there in that moment, I was none of those things. I was Major Ethan Lawson, officer of the Advanced Clairvoyant Operations Force, a unit so exclusive it did not appear in any public directory until very recently. Davies waited for me on the stage. When I reached him, he extended his hand with a firm grip and looked at me with an expression somewhere between deep respect and genuine apology. This officer saved countless lives in over 20 foreign territories. He personally commanded operations that fundamentally altered the trajectory of international conflicts. And yet, he quietly endured the dishonour placed upon him by a family's lie. He declared, making no attempt to conceal the emotion in his voice. Today, as a general officer and as a man of integrity, I am deliberately breaking protocol out of an obligation to truth and justice. Murmurs escalated into full-blown chatter. The name Lawson seemed to spread like wildfire among the commissioned officers present. Many knew exactly who I was, at least within specialised military circles. But to my immediate family, to the people I desperately wanted acceptance from, I was merely the son who had quit. Davies turned back to me and pulled me into a hard, meaningful embrace. Not a ceremonial gesture, but the powerful hug of a leader refusing to let a comrade fall. A ripple of applause began quietly and grew exponentially. The entire auditorium was standing, united in their ovation, with the sole exception of my parents. In that precise moment, I confess, I wanted desperately to turn and face them, to show them that the world had finally discovered the truth, that their disgraced son had returned as a man of stature. But I resisted the urge. That victory was not solely mine. It belonged to the brave men who had fallen alongside me in missions that will forever remain unrecorded in history books. It was for their memory that I remained standing tall. Ryan was the first family member to get to his feet. He sprinted toward me, still wearing the newly pinned insignia on his uniform, and pulled me into a confused, desperate, and urgent hug. "Why did you never tell any of us?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Because I couldn't," I replied, gripping the back of his neck firmly, just as I had when he was a little boy. And because no one was willing to believe me when it mattered most. When I stepped back, I glanced one final time at my parents. Harold resembled a trapped animal. The man who habitually dominated every family discussion with his loud voice couldn't even meet his own son's gaze. Judith still had tears in her eyes, but they were definitely not tears of joy. Davies then formally concluded the ceremony. "On behalf of the armed forces, I extend my deepest gratitude to all who serve," he stated. "But today, I also offer a public apology to those who served and were unjustly maligned and forgotten." I quietly left the stage. Nothing more needed to be spoken there. The emotional impact and the devastating truth had already been delivered. As I exited the auditorium, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Victoria, my wife, who was watching the event via a private live feed of the ceremony. A brief, simple message. "Now they know. Come home when you're ready. I'll be waiting." But I wasn't heading home immediately. Something deep inside me warned that the true, painful confrontation was yet to come. And for the first time in years, I was completely prepared to meet it. Few meaningful words were exchanged immediately after the ceremony concluded. Ryan looked at me with a potent mix of reverence and bewilderment. Judith seemed on the verge of collapsing, but meticulously avoided any direct eye contact. Harold? He simply stormed out of the auditorium before I even made it off the stage, mumbling something inaudible while angrily shoving chairs out of his path. Hours later, still wearing my civilian clothes and with the heavy recognition medal discreetly stored in the interior pocket of my jacket, I accepted Ryan's invitation to have dinner with the family. "They genuinely want to talk," he said, a vulnerable hope shining in his eyes that broke my heart a little. The restaurant was exclusive and quiet, the table reserved far from other patrons. I arrived last, as usual. The table was silent. Harold sat with his arms rigidly crossed. Judith stared blankly at the menu. Ryan, next to me, was focused on his phone, attempting to diffuse the palpable discomfort. Aunt Clara, our oldest relative, was also present, likely Ryan's attempt to temper the volatile emotions at the table. I took my seat. The waiter arrived to take our orders, but no one appeared willing to eat. When he withdrew, the inevitable Cold War began. 8 years, Ethan, Judith started, her voice tight and eyes fixed on the water glass. You disappeared on us for 8 years, without a single word, and now you suddenly materialise in a public auditorium with a general calling you Major. I took a deep, calming breath. I never truly abandoned you. I was always relatively close by, but my operational assignment strictly forbade any communication. Everything I did was by personal choice, yes, but also fundamentally by oath and duty. Harold let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Duty? Is abandoning your own mother and father considered duty now? No, Dad, I replied, working hard to keep my tone even. But honouring unbreakable oaths is, and I swore absolute confidentiality. I signed legal protocols. My life and the lives of literally hundreds of other operatives depended entirely on my silence. You could have provided some indication, some tiny explanation, Judith countered, her voice strained. You deliberately led us to believe you were a failure. I didn't lead you to believe anything, I interrupted, my voice gaining firmness. You chose to believe the worst. You were the ones who created and spread that false narrative. When I officially disappeared from the radar, when I stopped responding for mission security reasons, you didn't seek out the truth. You invented a humiliating story and broadcast it widely. Harold violently slammed his fist onto the table, causing the silverware to jump. And what exactly did you expect me to say, huh? That my eldest son vanished and no one knew if he was dead or alive? I am a former captain, Ethan. I have a reputation to maintain. No, I countered, feeling a hot rush of anger. You always prioritise your pride, but you never possessed the courage to defend your own son. It was significantly easier to claim I ran away, that I was weak, than to admit you simply didn't know the truth. You thought that would tarnish your precious name. He had no response. Judith tried to mediate. We simply wanted to understand, Michael. That is when Victoria arrived. No one expected her presence. She looked impeccable, as always, with her secure access badge discreetly pinned to her lapel, and a posture that seamlessly blended professional authority with elegance. She kissed my cheek and gracefully took the empty seat beside me. Good evening, she stated calmly. I trust you are all well. I have been granted authorization to speak on a few pertinent points. Harold glared at her, as if she were an unwarranted intruder. And who exactly are you? Victoria Lawson, she replied, deliberately showing her wedding ring. Senior analyst for the Strategic Intelligence Division. Major Lawson's wife, and more importantly, a first-hand witness to everything he has endured these last few years. The table fell into complete silence. Ethan served in operations whose precise details you will never be permitted to know, she continued. And everything he endured, he did for his country, for his honour, and yes, for you included. He was never weak. He was in fact strong enough to suffer in isolation while his own family publicly labelled him a coward. The silence was now absolute and heavy. And now, Harold muttered, his voice choked. You expect us to believe this? Just like that, suddenly. I am not asking you to believe, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. I am telling you this is the unvarnished truth, and I no longer have any necessity to conceal it. You will choose how you wish to process this information. But if you are waiting for me to apologise for not being the predictable son you wanted, I am sorry to disappoint you once again." Aunt Clara finally spoke up. "I knew this whole narrative was fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. I always knew you were not a coward, Ethan. But no one would listen. No one wanted to listen. They spoke exclusively of Ryan as if you had never existed. And he was not at fault either," I added, looking tenderly at my brother. "He was also a victim of the very same lie." Ryan shook his head, visibly emotional. "I believed it, Michael, because Dad always spoke with such conviction. I feel incredibly foolish." "You were just a boy, Ryan. You desperately wanted a hero in the family, and they handed you the most convenient packaged story." The waiter appeared with the ordered plates, but no one touched the food. Harold was breathing heavily, wrestling against his own palpable shame. Judith was silently weeping, gripping her napkin tightly in both hands. Victoria looked at me reassuringly and discreetly slid her hand over mine. "There is still time," Clara said, looking directly at Harold. "Time to repair this, to acknowledge the son you damaged out of sheer pride. But Ethan cannot achieve that for you. That reconciliation is solely up to you." I stood up from the table. I fulfilled my commitment. Mom, Dad, I was present when no one could see. And today, for the very first time, I no longer need to hide my true self. If you wish to know the real Ethan, the effort is now entirely yours. I settled the bill before anyone could object, and immediately departed because every necessary word had been spoken. For the first time in many years, I was not the person who owed any explanations. They say physical suffering is transient, but the humiliation that follows you silently, day after day. I understood that pain better than anyone. It wasn't overt torture. There were no outbursts or physical aggression. It was something far more subtle, more cruel. Being diminished, drop by slow drop, by the very people who were supposed to protect you unconditionally. After my initial recruitment, everything irrevocably changed. I vividly recall the exact day I received the summons. I was only 27 years old, a recent graduate in systems engineering with modest aspirations, to remain in the National Guard, advance through merit, keep my life simple, and my service record immaculate. But then Commander Hayes appeared, speaking of an ultra-secretive task force, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to serve the nation at an unparalleled level. "But you will have to officially vanish," he warned. "You will be severed from the public record. No familial contact permitted, save for strictly pre-authorized communication." I considered the terms carefully and accepted the assignment. Out of pure patriotism, perhaps a deep sense of national duty, or perhaps because I already knew deep down that my presence had never been truly valued in my family's home. During the first few months of absence, I attempted to maintain low-profile contact. I mailed innocuous postcards and emails containing generic, coded information, but received no response. Instead, the occasional return calls grew cold and distant. Harold refused to take my calls entirely. Judith spoke to me as if I were a complete stranger, and gradually, even that minimal contact ceased. I only discovered the narrative they were creating about me 3 years later, during a brief stopover in the United States between two highly classified missions. I had secured a 48-hour pass. I drove to Aunt Clara's birthday party, camouflaged in plain clothes. I simply longed to see Ryan and hear my mother's familiar voice, but everything I heard made me wish I had stayed in the shadows. "Ethan? Oh, he just disappeared," Harold boasted, laughing with a whiskey glass in his hand. "Couldn't hack it. 3 months in uniform and he begged to be discharged. Shameful, really a pity," a friend replied. "But it happens. That caliber of training is only for the few. That's why I say this one here." And he pointed directly at Ryan, who was still 17. "Will go far. He's got the inner fibre." Ethan was always lacking. My throat instantly seized up. I was standing mere yards away from them, just behind a divider, hearing every devastating word. That night, I slept alone in my rental car. I couldn't find the courage to knock on the door, not after hearing my mother's silent assent. She had failed to defend me. Not once. Slowly, I learned of other fabrications. How Judith had informed the neighbours that her elder son had simply lost his way. How at social events, Harold would proudly proclaim he at least had one son who was worthwhile. And I retreated deeper and deeper into my assignments, perhaps seeking in the danger of the operational field the recognition that would never come from my own home. There were moments when the pressure became too much, when I considered violating my oath by writing a detailed letter, sending a photo in full uniform with all my ribbons, or screaming to the world exactly who I was and what I did. But doing any of that would have been a direct breach of my sacred oath. And if there is one core principle I learned in the military, it is that your word is your absolute bond. I recall one grueling mission near Kandahar, Afghanistan. We had been covertly infiltrated for nearly 3 weeks, sleeping in shallow trenches dug into the ground, subsisting on bland MREs, and praying we wouldn't be compromised. One of the youngest recruits, Specialist Torres, asked how I managed to endure such prolonged separation from my loved ones. I answered with the raw candour that desperation allows. I simply imagine I don't actually have a family to miss. He looked at me confusedly, and I offered a faint smile, holding back tears. Ryan grew up hearing he was the superior replacement for the failure. He willingly embraced that role, completely unaware that the brother he quietly idolised was the same one his parents were publicly humiliating at every gathering. Yet, despite all the pain, I never once retaliated or reacted publicly. But inside, every word they spoke weighed down on me like a suit of heavy armour. When we did occasionally meet, Judith treated me like a distant acquaintance. Harold treated me like a calculation, error. And I meticulously pretended that none of it caused me pain. Even at my wedding, only Clara was present. Victoria and I conducted the ceremony discreetly at a small military chapel in Spain. My parents were intentionally not invited. Not out of malice, but out of logic. What possible role would they play there? Forced smiles while believing they were witnessing the union of a proven failure with a woman who surely didn't know the full, embarrassing truth. Victoria knew every single detail, every injury, every prolonged silence. And despite it all, she remained my anchor. She was the one who carefully pieced back together the man who returned broken from each assignment. And even if the entire world celebrated my decorations, my service history, and my advanced rank, nothing could ever replace the absent words, "I'm proud of you," from Harold. Nothing could erase Judith's constant expression of bitter disappointment. When I heard General Davies call out my rank, it felt as though a years-long, suppressed scream had finally been released. A dormant part of my identity instantly awakened. I was no longer the same man who once hid behind a wall, hearing his own father call him a shame. The difference now was that they knew the truth, and I was absolutely not going to apologise for having become a far greater man than they had ever anticipated. They would have to decide whether to treat me as the son who left or as the man who returned. And I, too, was unsure of how to proceed. We were all learning how to navigate this new reality, step by hesitant step, but finally without masks. It was Aunt Clara who introduced the first sliver of lightness back into that heavy environment. "Do you remember that time when Ethan got caught scaling the high school fence?" she recalled during lunch. "He swore he was just retrieving a stray baseball and came back with 2 sandwiches and a Coke." Ryan burst out laughing. Judith pressed her hand to her mouth, surprised by the sudden memory. Harold even managed a low chuckle, and I, for the first time in that room, fully roared with laughter. That single sound broke something fundamental. It was as if everyone was finally given permission to lower their guard. That afternoon, Judith invited me to look through some old photo albums. I opened each page like turning the chapter on another life. There were pictures of me as a child in my school uniform, with crooked teeth and wet hair after a day at the pool. And to my astonishment, the album didn't abruptly end in 2017. There were more recent photos of me, images Victoria had secretly sent over the years. Me at a military ceremony abroad. Me receiving a symbolic Veterans Award. Me smiling proudly with my unit in the background. "I pretended I didn't know your exact location," my mother confessed. But deep down, I think I just couldn't bear to admit I had truly lost you. Keeping these photos was my desperate way of saying there was still a fragile thread of hope. For the first time in years, I took her hand. She squeezed back, holding it like someone clinging to a lifetime of unspoken affection in a single gesture. With Ryan, the relationship quickly transformed into one of mutual respect and exchange. We sat late one evening on the patio, quietly sharing a beer until he finally spoke. I actually joined the armed forces because of you, not because of Dad." His confession surprised me deeply. I always thought you just wanted to prove something to him. At first, yes. But then I kept hearing the stories about the older brother who just vanished. The family shame, and somehow I knew there had to be more to it. It was like a part of me sensed that story was a lie, and I felt a strong need to understand the real you. We sat in silence for a long moment. "And now that you know," I asked. "Now I want to be half the man you are, and I want my future son to meet you someday." I smiled for the first time without any lingering ache in my chest. The family that had rejected me was now actively trying to rebuild itself, one broken piece at a time. 1 year passed. 1 year since Ryan's commissioning ceremony. 1 year since the devastating truth had come to light. So much had changed since that day. Today, I am at home. A real home, my home, with Victoria by my side, stronger than ever. And a new routine that combines rigorous physical training, mentoring junior officers, and giving lectures at military colleges. I haven't returned to the operational field since my last mission in Buenos Aires. I am still consulted for high-level operations, but I now serve as a strategic advisor, partly by choice and partly by design. After everything, I understood that the most difficult war I faced had already been won, the war for my own identity. That morning, I put on the ceremonial uniform again, medals perfectly aligned, posture ramrod straight. It was the day of my official decoration for Operation Griffin. But for me, it was far more than an honour. It was physical proof that I no longer had any reason to conceal who I was. Victoria helped me with the final adjustments to the uniform. She was radiant. "You look magnificent, Major," she said, adjusting the lapel of my jacket. "Just today," I replied. "Every day," she corrected. "But today you are exactly where you were always meant to be, being seen." The auditorium was packed to capacity. High-ranking officers, military families, and service representatives from various allied nations. But in the back of the front row, they were there. Harold in an impeccable uniform, just like in his younger days. Judith with eyes already moist before the ceremony even began. Ryan in his own hard-earned uniform. And Clara discreetly fanning herself with the programme. General Davies stepped onto the stage and began his address. He spoke of honour, discipline, and sacrifice. And then he spoke about me. Major Ethan Lawson served with outstanding courage in territories where few dared to set foot. He saved lives, led men, and faced unimaginable darkness without ever asking for acknowledgement. Today, finally, we bestow upon him the tribute he always deserved. I was called to the stage. When I ascended the steps, a thunderous wave of applause echoed throughout the hall. I saw Victoria's eyes well up. I saw Ryan clapping enthusiastically, like a brother who was finally proud without reservation. And I saw Judith crying, not from shame, but from pure, unadulterated pride. Upon receiving the medal, I requested the floor. This recognition, though conferred individually, represents every man and woman who serves in the shadows, who are judged without any right to defence, who sacrifice their reputation, their time, and sometimes their very lives for a country that doesn't always recognise their contribution. But above all, this medal represents something intensely personal: the truth. Because the truth will always find a way to surface, sometimes too late perhaps, but when it does, it brings true healing. The applause was deafening, but what resonated most deeply with me was Harold's embrace at the conclusion of the ceremony. It was strong, utterly silent, but charged with everything that had remained unspoken for years. It was in that hug that I finally understood. Some men win wars, others win silence. And I had achieved victory in both. The reception following the ceremony was organised by Victoria, a simple, elegant gathering surrounded by people who had been integral to my journey, even without knowing the full extent of it. Fellow mission specialists, retired commanders, and trusted friends. But what truly captured my attention was seeing my house, for the first time, filled with familiar voices that no longer caused me pain. Ryan was on the deck, talking with Clara about his plans for promotion within the Guard. Judith was proudly pointing out a framed photo of me on the living room mantel. And Harold remained slightly apart, observing the entire scene in silence, holding a glass of wine as if searching for the precise right moment to speak. And the moment arrived. After everyone had eaten, chatted, laughed and dispersed slightly, he approached me. I stood up, bracing myself for another contained, indirect comment, but no. "Can I speak with you, son?" he asked, his voice grave but noticeably different. There was hesitation. Harold, the man who never showed uncertainty, now seemed to weigh every word. We walked to my home office. He entered, surveyed the room and took a profound breath. I attempted to write down this conversation approximately 20 times, but nothing on paper felt adequate or fair. So I am going to say it as I should have said it years ago. Ethan, I am proud of you, far more proud than I can ever truly articulate. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. I wasted my entire life wanting you to be exactly like me, to follow the same rigid path with the same set of footsteps. But you didn't just forge your own trail. You transcended everything I ever dreamed for myself. I felt a stinging behind my eyes, but I managed not to cry. I simply let him continue. I always knew you possessed strength, but I foolishly confused genuine strength with simple obedience. You chose duty when no one was watching. You upheld your silence, even as you were humiliated. You protected lives, even when your own value was questioned. And despite all of that, you came back. Not because you were forced to, but because your heart is greater than mine. He stepped closer, putting his hands into his pockets, a characteristic gesture of his. But now he was disarmed, vulnerable, more human. I'm not going to ask you for instant forgiveness, but I want you to know that I will be here every single day, trying to earn that forgiveness, little by little. I embraced my father, the first time I had hugged him as a man, as a soldier, as his true son. It was a long, silent hug, charged with everything that was never spoken, but that was now finally felt. That night, with the house quiet and the moon high outside, I realised that what we refer to as reconciliation does not always arrive in a single heroic act. Sometimes it comes in a quiet whisper, in a shared glance, in a truth that is finally admitted. And in that house, for the first time, all the ghosts were finally at rest. 12 months passed since that momentous night. Today I look out the window of my new office. Not a military post, but a civilian one. I founded a support centre for veterans and military families who are dealing with separations, classified traumas, and the burden of keeping secrets. It is a dedicated space where the truth never needs to be suppressed again. I haven't ceased serving. I have simply changed the way I contribute. I receive weekly calls from high-ranking officers requesting me to give lectures at specialised academies, military colleges, and community centres, and they all begin with the exact same phrase. "You're the major, whose own family thought had deserted, aren't you?" "Yes, I am," I reply. "But now I am also the man who painstakingly rebuilt those family ties, who unearthed his true story, and who ultimately rewrote it with dignity." Victoria remains my steadfast foundation, my home. Recently, we began seriously discussing adoption, not because we feel any emptiness, but because we now have an abundance of room in our lives to love someone from the beginning, exactly as it should be. Ryan was transferred to a strategic base in the northeast. He is respected, highly competent, and calls every week to share his news. Judith and Harold regularly visit our home on Sundays. They bring dessert, sit on the sofa, and watch football. Sometimes Harold even helps in the garden in silence. But now, a gentle, understanding silence. Aunt Clara is still exactly the same. Direct, pragmatic, but full of warmth. She was the one who suggested the name for the support centre I created, Operation Truth. At the grand inauguration, with the press present and a platoon of new recruits seated in the front rows, I spoke briefly. "My name is Ethan Lawson. I was once called a deserter, a traitor, a coward. But today I stand here to declare that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always prevails. And if you too are carrying a heavy secret in silence, you are not alone." The entire auditorium rose to its feet, but it was not the volume of the applause that truly mattered to me. It was the profound knowledge that the young man who grew up trying desperately to prove he deserved love was now helping others understand that they too deserve it, even when no one is there to say the words. At the close of that afternoon, I walked out onto the centre's patio with a steaming cup of coffee in my hands. Harold approached, sat quietly beside me, and remained silent for a while. Then, without looking at me, he simply said, "You won, son." I looked up at the sky. It was perfectly clear, without a single cloud, with a golden light falling softly over the city. "No, Dad," I replied with a slight peaceful smile. "We won," and we raised our cups in a silent toast, not to the war that was finally won, but to the truth that was finally recovered, to the family that was courageously reborn, and to all the stubborn second chances that life insists on offering to those who refuse to stop starting over.